Happy to see everyone here. We're really excited for our last conversation for the series today, Diverse Stories. We will have 5 speakers, and we will start I'm Deb Willis, and I'm just really excited to share all of the voices that we've met over the past few years and new stories that we will develop. We're hoping to move this on to a project that will be a book and other types of public conversations. So we'll start with Ellen Toscano, who will set the framework for today.
Great, thank you, Deb. Welcome to everybody to the final Women in Migrations conversation. We had intended originally to have the 4 discussions in June. They were so successful that we expanded it to these 2 additional yesterday and today to include many more of the scholars and artists who are in our community, our Women in Migrations community. This series has been convened by the Women in Migrations Working Group, a project that convened first in Florence, Italy, in June of 2017. A book resulted from that project. A citation of that book will be in the chat. You can download it for free online. It has received great success with many people, particularly in Africa, downloading the book. We're pleased to see its wide dissemination. We had intended to be in DC in person and in Athens this summer. Neither was going to be possible, but thanks to many of our partners, we were able to pivot to this Zoom format. Thanks to NYU DC and the Bradimus Center and our colleagues Tom McIntyre, who you don't see, but is clearly in our presence, managing all of us, and Polly Chazarian. Thanks to both of you. And also to NYU's Office of Global Inclusion, Diversity, and Strategic Innovation, led by Dr. Lisa Coleman, and we have been joined in all of our work by Autumn Rain from that office. And thanks also to the Ford Foundation for funding. The goal of this working group has been to examine the role that art, history, and literature have played in identifying and remembering the migratory experiences of women through very historical periods of time and the present, and now in the context of a pandemic. While we generally think of migrations through a public policy lens, it is an essential viewpoint. We hope that our interdisciplinary lens will broaden the conversation and create, hopefully, a greater moment and space for reflection. In concluding this series, we want to thank the great audiences that we've had who have followed, many of whom have followed us through all 5, 6 panels. We hope that you will stay in touch. We will post the NYU DC website for Women in Migrations in the chat. We are about to open a website at Tisch School of the Arts for Women in Migrations. That too will be posted. And we hope, as Dr. Willis said, we hope that this series, this summer series, will result in a 2nd volume of Women in Migrations, Responses in Art and History. So logistically, we will leave time at the end of the presentations, hopefully 20 minutes for a Q&A. We invite you to submit your questions as they occur to you. If you intend a question for a particular panelist, please indicate that. I think we are closed captioning. Yes, we are closed captioning, and we are recording. So thank you again for joining us. And I turn to Cheryl Finley, one of the other organizers.
Thanks so much, Ellen, Deb, Tom, Nikki, all, Polly. Oh my gosh, there's so many names to give shouts out to, and especially to our panelists who joined us today and all of you who are listening in. we're really excited to share the work of the panelists today, especially in conversation about thinking about our diverse stories around women and migration. I'm Cheryl Finley. I'm the director of the Atlanta University Art History and Curatorial Studies Collective. We're based at the largest HBCU network in the nation at Clark Atlanta University, Morehouse College, and Spelman College, with amazing students and expert faculty who are really in the business of transforming and revolutionizing the art world as we know it. And not just because of the pandemic that we've all been faced with, but this is a mission that we were committed to a couple of years ago. I mentioned that too to echo Ellen's comments and our desires to work together to publish yet another volume related to our collective studies. And we have students who are conducting a virtual internship this summer with us who are actually transcribing these conversations in conjunction with the visual and also the audio and also the closed caption. So we hope that this information will be useful to us as we put our volume together, but also it'll be available on the website as it gets developed as well. So with that, I think I will turn it back over to Deb, and I'll see you at the very end where I will take the time to summarize our presentations today and also field questions.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thanks everyone again. Nora, we'd like for you to start. Thank you.
First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be here today. I'm about to finish a dissertation on the politics and aesthetics of the sugar plantation in contemporary Afro-Brazilian and Afro-Caribbean arts at Georgetown University. But today, I wanted to share with you a nonfiction writing project, a work in progress that is probably called How to Look at Silence. And it is about the migrations of the Black and indigenous women of my family between Colombia and Venezuela. And I would be more than happy to listen to your feedback at the end. So this project is tied to all the anxieties that the migration of Venezuelans to Colombia woke in Colombian society in the last years. There are around 1,008,000 Venezuelan immigrants in Colombia today. Women represent 44% of the immigrants. 40% have no documents. The corona crisis left those immigrants in an even more perilous situation. A big percent of them lost their jobs because of the lockdown, and they also have no support from the Colombian government. In the project, How to Look at Silence, I'm interested on looking at the migrations between Colombia and Venezuela from a personal and collective perspectives. My grandmother and two aunts migrated in the early 60s to Venezuela, from Colombia to Venezuela. Thus, half of my generation was born in Venezuela and the other half was born in Colombia. Since then, the relatives have been always back and forth. I was born in the Colombian Caribbean. So I've started to write this nonfiction project, and I will read 2 paragraphs of my writing. I'm going to read in Spanish because there is also some discussions about the language and the way we people from the Caribbean speak. So I want you to listen it in Spanish, and you will see the translations on the presentation. Los fines de semana de mi infancia se estremecían a cada hora con el grito de mami, mi abuela y orgullosa propietaria del primer teléfono fijo de nuestro barrio, la calle Aurora. El teléfono sonaba agudo e infinito. Mami descolgaba y el timbre de su voz no le envidiaba nada al de la más experimentada recepcionista. Casa del Vía Mármol, con quien tengo el gusto, saludaba a mami. Cuando salí a la terraza para avisar a la vecina de la llamada, su grito era una prueba incontestable de los años como vendedora de frutas en el mercado público de la ciudad. Fulana, mengano desde Caracas, se desgañitaba mami. Fulana atravesaba corriendo el salón hasta el rinconcito del teléfono, solitario y oscuro como un oráculo, y levantaba el auricular con las manos jabonosas de la lavada del sábado. No viene este diciembre, se fue con otra, a esa mujer no le importan sus hijos, eran las frases de las madres, las esposas, las abuelas, las tías, después de visitar el oráculo. A finales de los 80, los colombianos representaban cerca del 78% de los migrantes latinoamericanos en Venezuela. La mayoría de los trabajos eran en la agricultura o el servicio doméstico y el destino favorito fue el estado petrolero de Zulia. A Maracaibo, la capital de Zulia, llegaron Mami y mi tía Elvira por primera vez el 25 de abril de 1961. So I would like you now, I would like to share with you some of the feelings and some issues and some feelings behind the project. So looking at Colombian media in the last years, I have been concerned with some discourses about the migrations between Colombia and Venezuela. The first one is the idea of novelty, how the media represent the migrations as something new. On the contrary, my family is based on some kind of Colombian and Venezuelan transnationality. In fact, the first trip was made in the 60s and the family have been back and forth. In fact, many Venezuelan immigrants in Colombia today have the double citizenship. They are Colombians and Venezuela. Thus, one of the issues behind the project is the invisibility of my family in Colombia's national discourse. The second issue is how this invisibility is related to the question, who can be Colombian, or how does a Colombian look like? Colombia built itself as a white mestizo nation with a center in Bogota, the capital. This discourse has erased the presence and processes of other regions like the Caribbean. Tracing the responses of the Colombian media to the Venezuelan migration, we see that the migration started to be a problem when the roads of Colombian Andean cities like Bogota or Medellin got full of Black and indigenous people that speak Spanish with a Caribbean accent, like people from Venezuela or people from the Caribbean, as me. The project aims to write my family migration to Venezuela as part of these contemporary migrations of Venezuelans to Colombia. I'm working mainly with family photo albums, as you can see in the pictures that I'm showing you. Oral history, I'm also having conversations with my relatives, with my aunts and cousins. By now, I have focused on the first trip that my grandma made to Venezuela in 1961, and I discovered that it was a trip surrounded by some silences. I am trying to look into those silences and to understand them. My grandmother took care of me as a child in Cartagena, and she used to tell me stories about her time in Venezuela. According to her stories, everything was marvelous there. However, when grandma passed away, I started to talk to my aunts and my mother, and I discovered that grandma traveled for the first time to Venezuela in order to work as a domestic employee. She had to travel through La Guajira Desert, and she had to pass through a lot of very difficult experiences, but she never talked to me about this other side of the story. Actually, she burned the pictures of her first trip to Venezuela. For a gorgeous woman that loved to have pictures of herself, that was a very odd gesture, and I'm very interested on thinking why she burned the archive. Thus, when looking at grandma's first trip to Venezuela, I aim to understand the silences about her experiences, about her burning the archive, but also to connect those silences with the national silences in Colombia around these migrations and these populations. Grandma's experience could be mirrored in the one of the Venezuelan women coming to Colombia in the last years. For this reason, another layer that I would like to explore in this project is to weave my family memories with the discussion of some works of contemporary arts, like the ones by the Venezuelan artist Malu Valirio. In the piece that you are seeing, Valirio listened to the stories of Venezuelan women living in Colombia, and after that, she embroiders some of the women's sentences in these shoes that you are seeing. The shoes are called alpargatas, and they are used by Wayu people. an indigenous community that lived between Colombia and Venezuela. Thus, looking at my family archive and the way grandma shaped that archive, discussing the building of Colombia as a white mestizo nation, and dialoguing with works as the one by Malú Valirio, I aim to recover my grandma's stories and her silences and point out toward the silences around Venezuela migration to Colombia today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. So many diverse stories, and I love the aspect of the storytelling through shoes. Thank you. So we have next Sarah Khan.
Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay. Of course, big thanks to the doctors, Deb, Ellen, and Cheryl, and the whole Women in Migration crew. I'm just starting my timer. So my most recent body of work is entitled Undisciplined Pleasures, Vigilant Defiance. And it's a series of 22 edition prints. It's actually still up at 12 Gates Arts in Philadelphia until the end of September, and it's curated by our delightful Women in Migration colleague, Anna Arabinden Kesson. And this work is my ongoing kind of response and conversation to a Central Indian illustrated cookbook in Persian called The Book of Delights. And you see one of those illustrations here. It was created in the late 15th century. And in addition to the text, the manuscript includes about 50 illustrated miniatures with the Sultan, as you can see on the left, surrounded by his polyethnic retinue. Africans, Arabs, Central Asians, Turkic people who all migrated, forced or unforced, from the larger Indian Ocean world. And while I, investigated the food, culture, healing advice, and recipes that are found in the cookbook and that are fascinating and that it's an ongoing thing, what was most important to me first was to learn about the Sultan's harem, or zinana, as we call it in Urdu or Hindi. The Sultan retired to a city that he called the City of Joy. And I wondered who was the City of Joy joyful for? And as it being called the Book of Delights, who was it delightful for? So via mainly secondary research in English, I wanted to identify as well as I could kind of nuanced histories of the women serving and to elevate them from the literal sidelines and to break free from service to the patriarchy. And ultimately, before I say the sentence and I'll go on to my own work, a lot of the people that have influenced my work are Shazia Sikandar, Chitra Ganesh, Asaya Wolfak, Amitav Ghosh's book In an Antique Land, in addition to all of his works. But in this series, what I really wanted to offer was an alternative universe, a universe where named, assertive, empowered women, no longer in positions of servitude, engage and vigilantly care for each other. So this is the first in this series. It's called In the Wake of the Indian Ocean World Before European Colonization. And again, I take lead and inspiration from Saidiya Hartman, her notions of critical fabulation, but doing it in a visual way for myself, as I'm sure many artists are right now, and also the work of Christina Sharp, In the Wake. A paraphrase caption for this is sailboats traversed the Indian Ocean before European colonization and the introduction of chattel slavery. Skilled African seafarers in their wooden endows with lateen sails steered the coasts and open oceans. And this Indian Ocean world offered a rich cosmopolitanism with older and different hegemonies, hierarchies, and patriarchies. If you look to the right, there's a blow up of a map made by Al-Idrisi from 1152. And it's difficult to imagine it knowing our contemporary maps, but north is south and south is north, and the center of the world is Mecca. To the left of your screen is an astrolabe developed by Ibn Majid. And Ibn Majid came from a long family of Arab navigators. And it's thought that this astrolabe was probably used, or a version of it, by the Portuguese as they tried to figure out how to get from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of India. In this series here, it's the beginning of the undisciplined pleasures part. So I wanted to develop more animated versions of the occupants of the City of Joy without the Sultan. Here they engage with each other, vigilant, caring, conversing, listening, flirting, loving. The left-hand one is infused with rose oil, which is throughout the Book of Delights. The right-hand one is infused with orange blossom, also found in the Book of Delights. And more importantly, or just as important, surrounding them are ovens of all types of that time period. And they act as a metaphor for transformation, a metaphor of transformation of self, of substance, filled with care and possibility. And then I wanted to imagine some of the women across space and time, historical figures that I researched and came across. What would the world look like if these historical figures from the Indian Ocean world ruled across time and space? So on the left, you have Queen Bilqis receiving a medicated massage as she engages in vigilant pleasure. In the middle, you have Razia Sultan being fed and feeding, surrounded by foods. And I can talk about the color schemes and the insignias at a later time. That's a whole nother conversation. And then on the right is Abibach. And Abibach is an Ethiopian freedom fighter that I met by reading Maza Mengista's work, The Shadow King. So Queen Bilqis from Ethiopia and the Yemen, bathed in frankincense. Abibach, also from Ethiopia, bathed in myrrh. And Razia Sultan in the middle, coming from a geographical place where you had black pepper, cinnamon, and clove. All of these women are bathed in these delightful smells of pleasure and food and nourishment. And I'll just go back for a second. And what I want to do is each of these prints are captioned. So the caption for Abibach, which is the one you're looking at the far right in purple, reads like this. Fighter Abibach receives advice from her skilled hunting and forest guide, Fere Alam. Fere Alam means fruit of the world, who visits from the African island of Janjira, located near the coast of Bombay. Fare Alam, versed in the ways of people and plants, reminds Abibach that the cooks and healers, already exploited by chefs and scientists who appropriate and profit from their deep knowledge, are threatened with the loss of large swaths of biocultural diversity. The nobility rip off the commons that locals managed for millennium, attentive to experts who base their data on vernacular knowledge and other scientific systems. Abibach, unlike many of our contemporary leaders, listens and learns. So then I wanted to switch to the vigilant defiance. When alerted of injustice—
We have 1 minute left.
Okay, when alerted of injustice, the women harness their weapons. You have Queen Bilqis on the right, Razia Sultan in the middle, and Abibach on the right to arms. I can talk about later in the Q&A if people are interested. And I finish with the women raging into beauty. And this is captioned to arms, hashtag borderless, hashtag unframed, hashtag Indian Ocean world, for us, by us, about us, female identified, and more will follow. And I'll end with these 3 sentences. Raging into beauty, Bilqis, Razia, and Abibach revel in undisciplined pleasures and defy injustices. United across time and space, they're bathed in a golden light. The threesome soar on their stallions, unlinking themselves with grit and glee beyond the patterns of patriarchy. More will join. It's important to note that I inscribe my cultural heritage into everything I do. I pull from rich traditions, polyethnic and polyglot worlds, worlds that transgress borders and binaries, cultures and cuisines. And lastly, I etch a vibrant, reimagined Afro-Asian Persian past so that the future not only delicately cradles, but also amplifies history sidelined too long. And I take inspiration from Langston Hughes when I say, because I too am North America. Thank you.
Thank you. And just a quick question. What's the scale? We have a question. What's the scale of these?
These are about 24 by 34 inches. It's on handmade Vasily paper, which is traditionally used by miniature painters. Sure.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks so much, Sarah. This stories are just, fantastic in terms of the history of telling and making the art. Lee Rayford, please, next.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm working on sharing my screen and making sure that it's, let's see. Oh, okay. Sorry. We had a whole situation. We'll see if we can play it from the start. Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ellen, Deb, and Cheryl for inviting me to be part of this wonderful conversation. I'm really excited to hear everyone's work and to be in conversation with you all. I'm going to present today on the book that I'm working on entitled When Home is a Photograph, Blackness and Belonging in the World. And
Is
this,
it possible before you start, if you could
Sure.
start it to play from the start, the slide, so that we can see the full screen?
Oh, is it not? Oh, it's not playing. Okay, let's try that again. Hold on. It didn't. This is what happened the last time. Okay. Is it working now?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great. Awesome. Thank you. So this book, which is under contract with Duke University Press, is about how Black people, Black Americans specifically, use photography to make home in the world. I focus on a handful of well-known Black American activists and artists who traveled the world for study, for work, for movement building, sometimes for pleasure, and sometimes because their lives and the lives of their loved ones depended on it. Like many of us, their personal sense of self and their political platforms were elaborated through these encounters with the world. And like most of us, they made and collected photographs at every stage. When Home is a Photograph, Blackness and Belonging in the World considers the everyday image-making practices that this group of Black Americans, each committed to improving the conditions of Black lives globally, have engaged to imagine, identify, create, fabulate, inhabit, leave, and sometimes destroy home. Of course, home is not an uncomplicated concept. It can variously reference a physical location, a material possession, or an imagined geography. It can be a site of shelter and comfort where we are encouraged to be our best and truest selves. Home can also be a place of violence and uncertainty, ground zero of our most enduring traumas. So when is home a photograph, and how can a photograph become a home? So my book attends to the ways Black artists and activists engage photography as a mode of emplacing themselves in an anti-Black world. Such emplacement through photography is not simply or solely about a comforting self-image, but about the ways photography serves as a pedagogical tool for learning oneself. I argue that the photograph is a site where the terms of belonging can be worked out, where values can be iterated and practiced, whether of the Black collective asserting home in the world, Black kin longing for home in each other, or the Black individual self seeking home in one's skin. And so the photograph, so is a material object, and here I consider any image that can be held in your hand or held in the phone in your hand as material. The photograph offers a document one can turn and return to. Photographs can be the bit of home that dislocated peoples carry with them when they can carry little else. The photograph functions as a home that necessarily has to be in motion, respite and retreat that necessarily has to be mobile. Photographs have housed the performance of self-making that dislocated persons send home to visualize new belongings. In these ways, we might think of the photograph as its own shelter in place, the place where we can find cover in the midst of migration, transformation, and catastrophe. So this book offers an opportunity to consider photography as practiced by figures of the Black American radical tradition. And across the longer arc of my research, I've come to recognize that the photographic archives of Black activists, intellectuals, and organizations provide a critical yet understudied resource for illuminating the fraught history and politics of Black representation, as well as the role of photography in conceptualizing Black freedom in both the political and personal arena. My first book, Imprisoned in Luminous Glare, was especially concerned with photography as a social movement strategy, a necessary tool in an ongoing battle for justice that takes place in the visual field as well as in courtrooms and classrooms. In this project, I consider photography in its more intimate context, equally as fraught and political, but imbued with more complex personal motivations. More specifically, I'm interested in the way quotidian photographs, quiet images of family, of the domestic, of the everyday and unspectacular, give shape to our understanding and visualization of Black life, even for those who are the most recognizable, most vocal, and most resistant figures in our political culture. And so the two chapters that I'll just briefly mention in my time today are look at family photography, and they move from sort of masculinist visions of power and belonging to domestic images of home as practiced by Black women activists and mothers. Chapter 2 turns to the ethnographic and family photography and travel photography made by author and activist Islanda Good Robeson in the 1930s and 40s. In 1936, Good Robeson, perhaps best known as the wife of celebrated singer, actor, and activist Paul Robeson, set off on a 3-month tour of Southern Africa as part of her field study towards completion of an advanced degree in anthropology from the London School of Economics. Also a political mission to see firsthand in Africa in the early stages of anti-colonial struggle, anti-colonial struggle. The trip quickly became a family vacation when she chose to bring her then 8-year-old son, Paul Jr. In 1945, Robeson published her travel diary and photographs as the memoir African Journey, which featured her son prominently. And so this chapter considers Robeson's vision of Africa and asks what forms of diasporic identification and belonging might have been nurtured through the presence of Paul Jr. As a photographic subject. And this photograph features Paul Jr. on the extreme left. Robeson's photographs in African Journey draw on and blur the line between ethnographic photography and family snapshots. A desire to note the familiar unknowingly slips into recording the familial. If anthropological photography finds pleasure in difference, family snapshots locate joy in sameness, in the filial and the familiar. So in this chapter, I examine how anthropological field image, family, and tourist snapshots collide and collude to produce a distinct photographic archive of an African continent on the verge of decolonization, not merely as homeland, but as home place. And the third chapter continues the exploration of family photography through close examination of a family photo album made by former Black Panther Party Communications Secretary Kathleen Neal Cleaver of her family's time in exile in Algeria and France from 1969 to 1972. The Algiers album is one particularly rich artifact in Cleaver's personal photography collection, which I had the opportunity to help to organize and work on for over 3 years, which is the collection was just acquired by Emory's Rose Library this spring. While the photography collection broadly and the family albums specifically have great political and historical significance, enriching our knowledge about the Black Panther Party, the work of Black internationalism in the era of Black power, and gender politics in the context of Black revolutionary struggles, is perhaps best understood as a family archive. Thus, I read the Algiers album as a Black woman authored text that offers an affective and personal history of a movement that has been conveyed primarily as historical document. Its form as a family album forces us to reckon with the messiness of movement and cannot deny the failures and disappointments of family relations, whether a difficult marriage, a growing community of exiles, family as metaphor for nationalism, or as a map of intergenerational kinship ties. So this chapter addresses the role of photography, archives, and curatorial practice in the making of the Black radical tradition and Black feminist futures. So I'm trying to use this concept of when home is a photograph to argue that photography, while photography provides a useful tool for learning oneself and can function as a home for notions of self, community, belonging, and futurity, the investment in different kinds of genres rooted in Enlightenment conceptions of apprehending the world and visualizing the human often proves unsatisfactory. So for Black practitioners in my study, the engagement with different kinds of photography are always anagrammatical, to borrow from Christina Sharp. They are inadequate, if not inimical, to the task of envisioning Black life in its complexity. And therefore, taken together, they demand new modes of making and seeing photography. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. I'm really struck with the title, just reimagining the ideas that you presented here. Love the title, so that's fantastic. I'm loving all of the titles that we are experiencing today, so it's exciting to hear. Hannah Ryan.
So thank you so much for having me here today, particularly to Drs. Willis, Finley, and Toscano. Cheryl Finley is my former advisor and forever friend. An idea is woven through this series, a state of being, a component of identity, much as it weaves through our lives, minds, memories, bodies, and souls, motherhood. How does motherhood define one's experience of migration? In this case, I will discuss how motherhood informed every stage of one woman's experience, New Orleans photographer Chandra McCormick's displacement during and after Hurricane Katrina, which struck the Gulf Coast 15 years ago this month. This man-made disaster was thoroughly mismanaged at every turn, disproportionately damaging its African-American residents. In 1978, 19-year-old Chandra McCormick sought out 22-year-old photographer and fellow Ninth Ward resident Keith Calhoun to take her portrait. She expressed such sincere interest in the process that he invited her to learn more in the darkroom. Soon she was his mentee, then assistant, and by 1980, she was a photojournalist. They married, had 2 sons, and have spent the last 42 years as partners in life and work. Together, they have steadfastly documented Black life in the lower Ninth Ward, generating an incredibly vast and important body of work. Deborah Willis, who's here with us today, recently wrote of their work, "The couple's photographs are not passive, they are active. They animate and record. They enlarge and make life visible in this city. They attest to notions of public consciousness, love and respect of community motivate them to tell visual stories about their beloved birthplace. Dedicated to social justice, they have focused on themes of labor, agricultural work, the prison industrial complex, Black joy, the unique culture of their city, and most recently, the precarity of trans women in New Orleans. They're almost always addressed and discussed as a duo, one inextricable from the other. But today, in the spirit of this group and all their amazing work, I center Chandra McCormick and her long-standing commitment to capturing moments of loving intimacy between mothers and children. This is a portrait that Keith took of Chandra early in their partnership. The original negative, along with the vast majority of their life's work, was damaged when the levees a few blocks from their home and studio failed, the second floor blown away and 8 feet of water flooding the first. In a process I shall describe, in recent years, Chandra and Keith have been mining this altered archive, reprinting with eerily beautiful results. These abstract works are the focus of an exhibition I'm currently curating at the institution where I teach art history, St. Olaf College, titled, "We No Longer Consider Them Damaged." I just want to note this is a very recently reprinted image. When I commented on her lovingly intimate images of motherhood, Chandra replied, "I love to see the nurturing. There are families who are living in poverty, but that nurturing is always there." Here's the second image from the Sugarcane series, as a mother tends to her 2 children, holding one and minding another with her gaze. Watching, paying attention. These actions are central to motherhood. I'm watching you. I see you. Watch out. The words we use to assure our children that we are paying attention to them over time. Back in the city, Chandra captures a little girl helping her mother fold clothes, the mother teaching and the daughter helping. This work demonstrates Chandra's masterful framing. The child is framed by the dark trim, while a mother and daughter passing by on the sidewalk are framed by the window. I asked Chandra how mothering is unique in her community. She reflected, Well, at one time, lots of people were your mother. Miss Doreen next door, Miss Audrey across the street, Miss Maggie around the corner. Because parents allowed their children to be disciplined and monitored by others, it was different. And I guess it comes down to a level of respect. She also noted that both her mother and Keith's mother took care of their kids while they worked, and it worked well for everybody.
I am Chandra McCormick, documentary photographer, and I live in the Lower Ninth Ward.
My name is Keith Calhoun, documentary photographer living in the Lower Ninth Ward.
We're now standing at 5500 Charters, which is in New Orleans in the Lower Ninth Ward. And this was once our studio and our home where we did a lot of our photography. We had a dark room in there as well. And along came Katrina.
Chandra told me that when she was 8 years old, she barely survived Hurricane Betsy, which struck New Orleans in 1965. She said, "It was really horrific, especially for me, because I almost drowned. And then when Katrina was coming, my youngest son, Malik, was almost 8 years old. And so it felt the same." They decided to drive to Houston, each decision made with their children's best interests at heart. Research led them to a home in this subdivision in Spring, which you can see on the right, a suburb of Houston, where they remained for 2.5 years. Chandra says, "We went to Spring because we were looking for the best school district for our kids. Spring is in Northwest Houston, and most everybody else that I knew went to the east side. The way that happened was when people came to Texas, they had to go to resource centers, and the resource centers would say, 'We'll get you housing,' but people would get on the buses and wind up in dilapidated apartment complexes that had mold in them. And I found out from people I knew or had met in Texas that I needed to watch out. So where they gained better housing and education, they lost a sense of familial community. From Spring," Chandra lamented, "we missed the people the most. Just the feeling of our neighborhood. It was a more close-knit community there. Here you have cars. In New Orleans, we had people." So here you can just see the aesthetic difference of the two communities and how suburban Houston paled in comparison to the vibrant life of the Lower Ninth Ward, where they enjoyed chatting with friends and family and strolling on the levee's waterfront green space, which you can see just in the background of the image of their green studio. Chandra missed the emphasis on culture, and that extended to her children's education. In a school where they attended in Spring that was under 15% Black and lacked the enrichments they had worked hard to establish in their own community. Chandra says, "We had been so active in school and so many programs. We had so much going on, but when we were displaced, I couldn't put them all back together. All the things we were trying to strive for and the programs that my kids were in, that was all diminished." They connected with family and friends exiled in Houston, visiting the George Brown Convention Center to take photographs and conduct interviews. Here, a mother curls around her infant protectively in one of hundreds of beds in the convention center.
8 weeks later, we were allowed to come back to New Orleans. And so when we came back eight weeks later, this is what we found.
So here is their destroyed studio and home. For 5 years, Chandra and Keith rebuilt the home and studio while Chandra managed her younger son Malik's education, which was bungled by bureaucratic missteps, lack of resources, the firing of their certified teachers, and the influx of untrained educators through Teach for America, who were unfamiliar with the community and regularly called the police on students. It was Malik, then a young child, who insisted that they keep the damaged negatives, saying, "Try freezing them." And we have this son of artists to thank for the ensuing images, for the rescue of this critical archive that now has new life. Here, a mother tenderly cradles her snoozing child in church, the image itself tenderly cared for over time. Here, boys play in a wooded park while the mother watches on, holding everything, as we do. Chandra, I say, you're taking unthinkable damage and making beautiful images, even this week. It seems like radically sustained care. You keep caring for these images over and over again. How does that translate to your experience of motherhood, continuing to care and care? Chandra thinks and says, yes, it does, because it's the same. You care for your family and your things and take care of them. And that's the same loving care that I put into my work too, because I wouldn't have any of it if I didn't. Early on, before the hurricane, we talked about preserving our work. We would archivally sleeve our work, and those sleeves are what saved the work. If they hadn't been in everything, everything would have washed away. In recent months, Chandra and Keith have documented New Orleans in the time of COVID-19. And in Chandra's work now, I see a continued, radically sustained care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really great to see my friends here on screen and surprise. Thanks so much.
Deb, Chandra asked me to convey to you how much you've helped her throughout this whole experience.
Thank you. Gunja?
I want to start by thanking Deb, Ellen, Cheryl, Nikki, Tom, NYUDC very, very much for allowing me to be a part of this wonderful project, and to welcome all our audience members as well. My remarks actually introduce the essay that I contributed to the existing volume of Women in Migration, but it gives you a sense of my current research in the larger book project. Because this essay is part of a book project in which women's freedom flights flesh out for us the interface among the personal, domestic, and international politics of slavery and freedom in the 19th century. My canvas is a transnational one. It is a canvas that was knit by the blood and toil of human chattel into international networks of trade and travel and conquest and colonization, of politics and ideology and culture and community. It is a canvas that the march of abolition and empire balkanized and realigned along political boundaries of difference over slavery. An imperial power loomed over these divisions on the high seas and the lands that bordered them. This was the British Empire, which saw anti-slavery activism at least partly as a way to secure the moral and material foundations of imperialism. So I write about women on the margins who sought to reinvent themselves by crossing borders erected by the language and institutions of imperial abolition. Now, my narrative begins in the resistance circles of African America. And for some reason, I'm not able to advance my PowerPoint here. Sorry about that.
Tom, are you able to assist?
Click on the frame and then use your arrows to advance.
Okay. Okay, great. Thanks very much. So these expatriates deployed the tools of diplomacy to forge a diasporic politics of freedom and empire beyond the boundaries of the nation state. As many scholars have noted, since the birth of the American Republic, Canada, of course, had established itself as a magnet for refugees from North Atlantic slavery. Revolutionary era loyalists, Jamaican Maroons, Black veterans from the War of 1812, some of whom had received land grants in what we know as Ontario for siding with the British. Amid heightening sectional tensions in antebellum America, African-American expatriates contrasted empires of slavery and freedom. On the one hand, you had the American Southwest, which for white strivers conveyed a mystique of liberation and upward mobility, but as we know, this was inextricable from the dehumanizing shroud of Black bondage. On the other hand, there was Canada West, where fugitives fled ostensibly to breathe free under British suzerainty. African-American emigres to Canada constructed a sense of diasporic identity, as scholars have noted, with Britain's emancipated subjects in the West Indies. They sought to incorporate this Black British diaspora into an imagined imperial nation premised upon British benevolence. Thus, they celebrated Caribbean emancipation, emphasized Black British subjects' piety, industry, and capacity for labor, and sought British help to advance Black education. Above all, they actively lobbied metropolitan authorities in London to protect fugitives from extradition to the US. It is within this framework of a strategic engagement with politics of imperial abolition that I profile the pioneering free-born journalist and emigration champion, Mary Ann Shadd Carey. What set her apart, however, from the male champions of these emigration politics, I argue, was her injection of the discourse of gender into a diasporic conception of imperial belonging. As is well known, Shadd Carey was a Delaware-born abolitionist and women's rights activist. She moved to Canada West following the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. She blazed a trail for African-American women in journalism by editing and publishing a newspaper called the Provincial Freedom. And through this organ, she advocated emigration to Canada, which she argued was part of a colorblind anti-slavery empire with a woman at its helm, namely Queen Victoria. So in other words, I argue she refashioned familiar American narratives of westward expansion by locating the liberating promise and economic opportunity of that expansion in Canada, and by writing enslaved and free women of color as workers, as citizens, mothers, and wives and subjects into that migration narrative. Now, she did reject repatriation to Africa. She saw this, like many abolitionists did, as a plot to rid North America of free Blacks, essentially as a variant of anti-Black racism and colonization. But then what I do is I follow the discourse of British imperial abolition into the Indian Ocean for comparative purposes. And there we find that imperial abolition becomes messy and inconsistent because the British, of course, proved very reluctant to act against bondage if it threatened to disrupt their revenue arrangements in British Asia, or if it threatened to alienate local elites. But I look at evidence of women on the margins who nevertheless used the formal institutions of imperial abolition, whether law courts or police stations, depositions, and so on, as well as the language of that anti-slavery empire building in order to challenge such deference. So I tell the story by tracking the circulation of enslaved African and South Asian women among nodes of commercial exchange from East Africa through the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea into the Indian subcontinent. There, narratives of slavery, as we know, are intertwined with imageries of the Oriental harem. When these women, of course, as in this famous piece by John Frederick Lewis, they appear as sex objects, right, in these representations. But when they cross borders of jurisdictional difference on slavery, they become subjects of history. In their various roles as captive, rebel, or refugee, they generate testimonies for governments fighting over slavery. Their voices turn slave statistics into names and places. They're transformed from objects of imperial benevolence into witnesses and mediators among powerful men, whether sultans or viziers, judges, merchants, missionaries, and imperial bureaucrats trying to negotiate the politics of slavery. For instance, I use archival traces of these women contained in depositions like this one to write about enslaved women who scaled the walls of a Mughal palace in Delhi, India, in the 1820s, in 1828, and claimed protection in a British colonial office. Now, the king's son claimed them as concubines, but the women said that they had been independent shopkeepers, that they had been kidnapped and sold into slavery and mistreated as domestic workers. My account details how their voices mediated a dispute over slavery between powerful colonial officials and an Indian emperor. The women in this case had to convince the colonial bureaucrat that they did not in fact have sexual relations with any men in the zenana in order for them to be set free. But in the process,
Gunja, we have 1 minute.
Use these,
Gunja,
okay.
We have 1 minute left.
Okay. Okay. So they use these depositions then to breathe life into the idea that migration makes meaning, that civic identities transform in transit from one place to another. Thank you.
Thank you. Josina.
Hello, hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the invitation, Deb, and Ellen, and Cheryl. I'm super happy to be here presenting with you all. Let me see if Gonja.
Can you take that?
I'm trying to stop share.
Yeah, but meanwhile, just wanted to say that it was fascinating to be in this Zoom conversation, traveling around the history of different places and see how we have so many interconnections in history. So let me share this one with you. I'm Dulcina Abreu. I'm a Dominican York artist and museum worker. And today I want to present a little bit about my work that intersects movement, intersects history, and have a little bit of focus on migration. So the first one, I wanted to explore my identity, moving from the Dominican Republic to New York, seeing my body as a body that it was already racialized, that was also compared to the history of other Dominican Yorks that were not necessarily having my own identity, and as well as seeing New York as a space or as a sanctuary for me, because as Amarela Varela, the writer and sociologist from Mexico says, many of us are doing migrations as a forced migration, not necessarily movement because we decided or were invited, but because our existence needs to have that to continue. So one of the points where I started to explore this movement as migration was with this piece. This piece is called A Skin Between One, and I was originally a painter, and I started to explore more the space because I was feeling disconnected from my family. Disconnected a little bit because of the language in New York, having more Spanish than English, and migrating as well from one one language to another one that it was very dissected, that it was Spanglish, and very specific Dominican Spanglish. So I think this one I started to explore the space and started to see what other representation of Dominicans I was having around. So the first ones that I saw were my family. The most of them were workers, labor workers or construction workers, janitors, they were doing delivery for certain things, for pharmacy or for food. And the other ones that I saw at school were the people that were painting, janitors, or ones that were doing as well construction at school. So I found in construction work and craftsmanship, my medium to continue exploring movement, and as well a direct connection with storytelling. So for this one, I started to explore how many of oh baby, many of like these workers were like sharing their stories when I was like painting my studio in white every time I was doing an installation, and they were like, oh, what are you going to do? What is the next thing? So I felt like very interesting relationship in like how they were like decontextualizing like for certain moments like their own bodies in the space, and like trying to explore like artistic expressions like in the way that they were like kind of like interacting to me, or like kind of like co-creating like what it was going to like be next. So I started to like think about like co-creative processing in this one. So for this one, I painted a whole room in a very shiny pink. And I started to think about like going back to the womb of my mother, because I was like feeling very disconnected from my family. So, and disconnected from painting. So what I did, it was like, as a Dominican York person and labor character, I did like a whole painting of a room, and then I started to dig in between the painting and the drywall to create space for myself and for my body in between these two, in between these two materials. They are together, but it was like very interesting to me to as well feel how was like this like movement of like inserting myself into this womb, as well like creating this kind of like drapery. And remember as well that like many women of my family were working in like fashion district in New York, sewing, or like doing a lot of like the technical things that like big designers were, you know, having like many like Latinos or South Asian women that were doing all these like very detailed things like on their fashion. So for that one, it was like very interesting to me to like kind of like find like these like points in between like different stories between me, my family, and another migrant woman, and as well, and I started to like explore my own like gender. So during that time, I was like a little bit like migrating from like just like I was born as a woman, I was raised as a woman, and starting to feel like I think there is something in me that I have a very personal way of seeing femininity. So for the next one, I started to explore my own femininity through fashion. So one of the relationships that like I was having with my mother, it was like it was the clothing and the way that she like kind of like imposed me or like give me or like try to, oh, my internet is failing. Oh, but it's here. Okay. Oh, my bad. Okay, let's see if like it's gonna work now. Oof. So for this next piece, I started to like see how like before like moving from like this space in between the latex, the painting, and the space, the drywall, I could like extend my body and like try to use like these like prosthetics in order to see how like movement as well was going to like give me certain tools that like my own like being was maybe not giving me at that time. So I was like thinking a lot about like pacas. Pacas are like these like boxes that people here in the US like make, or in Europe to send to another countries of the South Belt with a lot of clothing or like or food or certain things of like primary needs, and they put all these things that are used, like clothes that are used, blah, 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 and they send it to their other countries as remesas. So I remember like growing up like with a lot of like shoes that were like another size, but like my family was sent it to me, and we were gonna, you know, if they were like shorter, like you just like use a very thin shoe like sock. If they are like larger, you use two. But like you were in this like movement that you were like giving some sort of your identity to like Malia, like yeah, to fit in some sort of like first need, but at the same time it's like a give and take, because like those things like were not choose by you. They were there and they were a gift and they were full of love because like your family was giving that to you, but they were not necessarily your own expression. So I decided to like make these like shoes to like explore this like weird relationship that I was having with femininity. So I multiply my own size, that I was like just realizing that I was like size 5W in New York. I always thought that I was like 6 or like 6.5. Well, so I decided to like take their own craftsmanship that like a lot of like construction workers were doing and like use plywood to make the shoe. So at the same time, I was like thinking a lot about how like migrants like do all these things in the house, like, you know, with like plastic materials. So they were out of necessity, but they were really creative. So I want to permeate my work with that. So I started to like create like these shoes out of like construction that were like super far away from like the aesthetic of what we see in Dolce & Gabbana or Prada or any other like shoe that we see in museums or like very highly speak. So I started to work with this, and this one was very important to me because another like Asian immigrants that were in the school as well like came by and were like asking me like, oh, like my grandmother has like styles like this, and like it started the conversation about like storytelling about their families back in China or in Japan, and like that thing was like very important to me. And so I started realizing that I was like having some sort of thing with history.
Dulcina, we're at time now. We're out of time. We're at time. Yes,
okay.
I'm so sorry because I'm loving those shoes. I want a pair.
Okay, so well, thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dulcina, and we will all be in touch for future projects. So go ahead.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
For sure. Oh, I was just
Sure.
going to start with questions.
Okay.
And again, just want to echo Deb and thanking all of you, Nora, Sarah, Lee, Hannah, Gunja, and Dulcina. And before I get to the questions in the chat, just very quickly, and we have one question I think will fit all sizes, fit all of us. But I just wanted to say, well, thinking about those lovely shoes, I'd like a pair too. That there are many ways that your presentations today really connected and brought together these conversations around women in migration through autobiographical stories, through questions of home, what home is, how we make home, through thinking about the comparative and also the global. These conversations were truly spanning the globe today. They're transatlantic, they're trans-Indian Ocean. They were also incredibly sensorial. I mean, I could smell, you know, the cookbook, Sarah. I could also hear these different languages that are being spoken. I was a Spanish major in college, so to be able to hear, Nora, how you read what others would have read in English, but I heard it and understood it in the Spanish tongue, and also to think about the way that language is something that when we think about how we move through space, how language is something that also is malleable in the same way that, as you were just sharing with us, Dulcina, you know, these shoes are meant to represent how our identities themselves are malleable through movement. We see this, of course, in the work of Chandra and Keith McCormick, but especially in the work of Chandra McCormick as it relates to women's stories and mother stories during the hurricane and through other times of movement. And I think that just thinking about these everyday practices that relate to things like language, smells, taste, movement, that really reverberate through the polyethnic and through the spatial, can also be seen in Lee Rayford's question about when home is a photograph through the work of the Black activists that she shares with us, or even through the work that Gunja shows, where she goes from the sort of Caribbean, North American, to the trans-Caribbean, across the transatlantic, if you will, in the presentation. So I'm going to pause and just go to the first question after that quick summary, because we've got about 15 to 20 minutes to finish. This first question is from Scott Linder, and he asks, or says, "This is such a wonderful, wonderful food for thought. I'm interested in how you all define and perhaps desire to bridge the gap between the interior and the exterior aspects of migration, the interiority of the private and domestic experience, and the exteriority of travel, worldly experience, and perhaps the outward signals of migration, parentheses, movement." So this is a question that is open for all to answer, and it would be great maybe if each of you could take a stab at it. It's available to you written in the Q&A.
And you can answer in the Q&A later as well.
Would anyone like to take a stab at thinking about how you define and perhaps desire to bridge the gap between interior and exterior aspects of migration? We've had conversations about language. We have titles even to papers that talk about, you know, how to look at silence as an example.
I can. I can take a stab at that if you.
Thank you, Gunja.
Yeah. In the context of slavery studies, as we know, the external quite literally radically transforms the interior, right? And this transformation is quite visible in the archives. What I almost wanted to do for this presentation was to sort of trace the trajectory of movements of say, fugitives across borders of difference over slavery. In North America, you can track those movements on the in the archives. You can see how marks on slave schedules are quite literally transformed into flesh and blood, into relationships, into names and places. And so I think the very fact of movement transforms home lives, transforms in the context of slavery studies, transforms the meaning of family, transforms the meaning of, frankly, property, and are inextricably interlinked. So yeah.
I can answer this as well if you'd like.
Hannah, yes, please, thank you.
Sure. So as an art historian, pretty much all of my research is about absence and the missing lived experiences of women, and how those lived experiences are not reflected in the dominant culture, right? And so for me, my PhD dissertation that I worked on with Dr. Finley was about lactation imagery and how it goes so unseen, unacknowledged as a really valuable form of labor and exploited form of labor. And in the work of Chandra McCormick, I think that to use a word that Lee used, the quotidian, right? Those quiet moments, those kind of just normal moments of everyday life are things that we should really highlight as women scholars. Even just Dr. Willis having her grandchild, I think in our talk should be so normal and so celebrated. And yeah, so I think that that idea of interrogating absence and interrogating the interior is actually quite radical.
Cheryl, I'd like to add
Please.
just thinking about these women identified individuals in the harem. This is from 1450s to 1500. And it's this, you know, what languages were they speaking? East Africans, when they heard, and this is historical fact, for 7 years in Bengal, I can get you the exact dates later, Abyssinian Africans ruled the Bengal region. This is before the flowering of the Mughals. And so, and they eventually dispersed to the area of where the Book of Delights was written in central India. And so I'm just imagining, what were they gossiping about? Did you hear that they overthrew so-and-so? I mean, serious, these are real conversations that happened. And the languages that they used, and who was cooking the food. In that Indian Ocean world scene that I created, you know, we think of men, we think of seafarers, we think of African men, but there were women on there too. What were their conversations? What did they look like? What did they put in their hair? What did they put in their pockets? I want to know those things. So in terms of movement and that Indian Ocean world, I just want to bring that to the fore, as many scholars and artists are doing.
Go.
Muted, Cheryl.
Cheryl is mute. You are mute.
Cheryl, you're muted.
Thank you. I was saying thank you to Sarah, and Nora, please go on next. And I just want to put another question in there as food for thought, because a couple of you have already mentioned this in your answers. And the question is from a woman named Lena, who was at one of our conferences in 2017, and she said that she delivered a paper on migration, language, and personality, and if anyone might want to address migration and language issues.
I can say, go Nora.
Okay, sorry. I was remembering this. I mean, like one of the, I was remembering that once I came back to Bogota where I did my undergrad. I mean, it was like 2 years ago, and I was with this taxi driver, and he listened to me. He was like trying not to talk about the Venezuelan migrations in Bogota because he thought that I was a Venezuelan. In the moment that I started to talk to him, I have to say to him that I was Colombian. So there was this thing that he was like, he listened to me. There was some kind of recognition, like, you are Venezuelan. So in that moment, I discovered that from that moment in Bogota, I just started like to be very emphatically about me being a Colombian woman from the Caribbean, because I was feeling that there was a lot of different feelings around me, because they were imagining, because of all the anxieties that are in Colombia in this moment around the Venezuelan migration. I felt some violence, you know. So I just started to think about it in the way that my grandma, she was like also shaping the archive about her experience as a Colombian migrant in Venezuela. I feel that the fact that she was like also like trying to, I mean, in fact, she born some part of the archive, no? It was like also in a way answering this violence that she received while the time she was in Venezuela, but a lot of this violence were related with the language. So for me, it was very important like to read in Spanish, because I have like this Caribbean accent that in Colombia is related to the accent from Venezuela. So I'm also like, even when I'm in Colombia, no, my family is like Colombian, Venezuelan family, but I'm also like, all the time when I'm in Bogota or in Medellin or in the cities in the Andean, I have to, how did you say? I have to negotiate a lot in the way I'm speaking. And I feel that my grandma had to do that. And the way she shaped that archive, she shaped that photo album that I'm now looking at, is like a proof of that, of this negotiation that also passed through the fact of the accent, no? Which Spanish are you speaking? It was.
I don't know if like there is time for me to say a little bit. Cheryl, let me know.
Oh, please. Yes, please.
Okay, I think like this is like one of the topics that I get more excited about, because in the museum, we work with that all the time. Like at the beginning, it was like a lot of people like getting anxiety when we were like speaking Spanish, when you find someone in the elevator, but now it's like they need us because we are bilingual. And it's like, it's super interesting how like all these like conversations are shifting as well. as like even like the conversations with our own families when we are now have an accent because we are like speaking in English and they feel like, you know, like a tradition, like a traitor of the nation, their own nation over there because we are having like another accent. But the truth is like we are speaking in English all the time now, and it's a little bit difficult to switch sometimes, but it is interesting to have a multilingual thinking process because like through this thing, like we can like find innovation in whatever like we see. We can find poetry in whatever thing we do. And I think it's like very interesting to think about that because like English is very structural. And like it's like who, where, when, you know, and in some way, like I think like we lose like this like part of like imagination that Spanish has or French has, that sometimes you're describing something, but like this ambiguity that you don't know truly what it is or what it's from, give you like some space for imagination. Just like wanted to say that.
That's great. That's great. So I saw Lee, you were, I think, trying to get a word in. I also wanted to just note one of the anonymous attendees' comments, which said that the conceptual answer to the question is in Dulcina's first slide of her room painting performance. And I think that's a really, really interesting, you know, contribution and way to look at the question as well.
Just a reminder, we have 5 minutes left.
Thank you, Deb.
Sure. Yeah, no, this has been great. I guess I just wanted to say sort of to the first question, I think what a lot of folks seem to be pointing to also is just the kind of false binary of the public and private, of the domestic and the, the political, that then is made, and the kind of the falseness of that binary becomes very clear when we start to look at women and women identified stories and modes of expression. And I think it becomes a question then of like what can be said as opposed to, the distinctions of what it is that is the kind of, or what's being talked about. So like the kinds of like how those things can be expressed. And so I was also thinking about, I think to the second question about language, a lot for me, particularly with the Cleaver family album, has been thinking about how she really used photography and the family album form to be able to tell a different kind of story about exile than the one that she writes in a very formal kind of, which actually ends up being her senior thesis in college about the period of the Black Panther Party's international chapter and the time in exile. And that photography becomes a kind of a mode of articulation in some ways, in the ways that Dulcina describes, right? That is beyond language, that kind of gets us to ambiguity, that is enables us to kind of see and express in ways that that language, and certainly, for Cleaver, like a kind of academic historian's English, right, can't, as an effective form, can't get to some of a different kind of texture of experience.
Take my mute off. I think another way to also get an answer, and there are many of them, to this question, the question about, about language, but also about inside and outside activity, is through the works that you all have presented today. Many of you all have presented through language, through the sensorial, but also especially through the photographic and the photographic album and the narratives that albums can tell. So if we talk about language, that language might be something that someone actually writes. So something that, if we take the example of Kathleen Cleaver, she actually writes, of course, and then there's the other language of the images themselves, the sequencing, the series, the editing, the choices that are made. So I think just to kind of think about different ways that we can consider language for our project. So the last question that I'd like to get to today is one that was addressed to, I think, you, Hannah Ryan, regarding Chandra McCormick's work. And the question from Albert Bernier is, did migration from Louisiana to Texas impede the way, and I'm going to say this is probably for the artist, you approached photography and your relationship with new photography composition? So maybe if you could think about that question, Hannah, through the work of Keith and Chandra.
Yes, absolutely.
And there's another question too, if you could please reiterate and say something more about the project that you are doing, your exhibition, and your relationship to Keith and Chandra, and know that we have about 2 minutes left.
Okay, I'll be very quick. So I'm an art historian, and I'm curating an exhibition on their work right now that is derived from that damaged archive. So the reprinting of damaged negatives and slides that I showed, and that is supposed to be going up on October 1st. So if everyone could cross all of your fingers, that would be wonderful. I'm also working on a catalog on the show, and I read a McNair Scholars Research session this summer for a student, and I hope to send a group of McNair students next summer to preserve and digitize their work. So that's my relationship to them. Yes, the experience changed their work tremendously, having access to their equipment, not having access to their equipment, trying to focus on the other people who were displaced and being able to connect with them in Houston shaped their project. Just not having the aesthetics of the city that they loved shaped their project. But all of that meant that when they returned to the lower Ninth Ward, they had totally newfound, just absolute gratitude for being able to be back and photograph everyone. And this experience of having so much damage and reprinting it has meant totally new and really enriched appreciation for their work from them and from everyone. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you all. Deb, Ellen, would you like to have a last word?
Let's hope that we could just think that both of us will have 2 seconds to say something. But one, we hope that we will see you again in the fall when we plan our next event. And Ellen?
Yeah, and if you presenters and all the presenters we've heard from before keep us aware of what you're doing and how your work is progressing, we will continue doing projects, and we would love to continue including you. And if any of you in the audience have work that you would like us to consider or know about, please let us know that as well. And thank you all for sticking with us over 6 presentations.
And I also just want to remind everyone to please remember to vote. Please remember to register to vote. Please remember to complete the census. You can do it online.
Thanks so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.